music to the noise, yeah, the mess we make. Machine Pun Kelly get caught in the fake. Facts and logic with a twist of chest. Strip it down to truth, yeah, forget the rest. Humor blows the lies right out of the park. Look beyond the shadows, protect the dark. Sparks of laughter fire up the night, bringing clarity when they blur the fight. Cut through the chaos, yeah, the tangled lies. Machine Pun Kelly with a set of clear eyes. Truths and jokes gonna rock this show. Step into light where the real facts flow.
Machine Pun Kelly here, joined today with my friend Arturo Dominguez. I met him through a mutual friend. He was a guest panelist here at one time, and said some really smart things that made me interested in finding out more what he has to say. So can you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, Arturo?
Yeah, I'm an independent journalist, Arturo Dominguez. I've worked at Latino Rebels, Futuro Media. I have articles published all over the place online, a lot of medium-owned publications. Been published in Latin America, also in Albania, and a couple other places. I'm mainly focused on so I guess you could say Latino related issues like Latin America. Immigration's a big thing for me. Very large immigrant family. All of them from Latin America and the Caribbean. So, mostly focused around human rights. I'm not really a big mainstream media kind of guy. I like to call out a lot of what they say, which is why my newsletter is called Decolonized Journalism. So, kind of take a different approach to reporting stuff from Latin America, particularly, and immigration and stuff. So, essentially that's it,
So, when one of the things I've been looking at on your Substack, you've been talking a lot about, and I don't think the media has been paying much attention to it, which is, kind of justifies what you just said about the media. This, there's a kind of there's like this ability to deputize local police forces and kind of make them surrogates for ICE, and there's actually quite a bit of this. Can you explain more about what all that's about?
So it's what we refer, it's the 287G program, and it's been getting a lot of attention this time around with Trump. It's been around for a long time. Before ICE, it's a part of the Immigration and Naturalization Act. But once the Department of Homeland Security was created, there was a more conscious effort to recruit agencies. So typically, federal agencies don't get involved in local law enforcement type stuff, right? Unless there's something big, and say a police department needs help from the FBI, so they'll call in the FBI. In the case of the 287G program, it's reversed, right? So it's more like DHS is recruiting police departments and sheriff's departments, and under Trump, they've expanded it to basically all local and state law enforcement agencies. So like your attorney general's office, parole boards, things like that become part of the 287G program. There's three different aspects to the program. One is they call them models. One is an enforcement model, where police officers essentially train to become ICE agents on the street. There's the jail enforcement model, where essentially they basically run anybody through immigration databases, and if there's an administrative warrant, not necessarily a judicial warrant, a county jail or a city jail has the option to to hold that person on what's called an ICE hold. So, for example, here in Houston, when I did an investigation in the Harris County Jail a couple years ago, and it's still that way, that the Harris County Jail maintains about 2,000 people in its jail on ICE holds, and they don't have a direct 287G program. They just essentially do it voluntarily, and that's how that works. And then there's what was the other? Anyway, at this point, right now, there's 1,155 local and state agencies that are part of the 287G program. Interestingly enough, about 350 of those are in Florida, about 220 of those are in Texas. So at least a third, or over a third, or more, close to half of them are in 2 states. Most states, especially the further west you go, the less likely it is to see these agreements. I don't know what the correlation is there. Obviously, California and states like Oregon and Washington aren't real big on those things, but like even in like Chicago area, you might have some smaller departments that are part of it, not necessarily Chicago PD, but yet it operates as a force multiplier. So, under the Trump administration, they expanded ICE operations to include agents from like the DEA, ATF, FBI, and those guys added 10, 20,000 more federal agents as a force multiplier on its own. But when you include 1,100 police departments, now you're getting into some bigger numbers. And there's a reason why 25% of all ICE arrests occurred in Texas, and that's because in Texas we have a state law that requires sheriff's departments to be part of the 287G program. Right. So some sheriff's departments that are not too keen on doing it, they sign up for the warrant service model. And the warrant service officer model is essentially where they assist in, serving warrants. The issue is a lot of police departments won't honor an administrative warrant because an administrative warrant is signed by, say, a supervisory type person at ICE. A judicial warrant is signed by a magistrate, a judge. So some of these departments, the sheriff will sign up to be a warrant service officer instead of signing up the whole department for any one of the 3 programs. And that's how they kind of skirt around the state law a little bit. They don't necessarily participate. But, DHS and ICE are offering police departments quite a bit of money to train their officers to be ICE agents. And I never heard an exact number, but I know the police chief in Dallas at one point mentioned that he was offered over 10 or close to $15 million to be a part of the program, and he declined.
Like his department was offered that money? Like he wasn't personally offered that money?
Yeah, like he was offered that for the department, right? And he declined it.
For a lot of these departments, that's a
lot of money.
Change. And that's our taxpayer money, by the way.
Right. So, with all the money that Congress gave Homeland Security and ICE this year, they're just burning through it. They're supposed to hire close to 10,000 agents. I don't even know that they're that close. It's hard to say because this administration is not giving us a lot of data. And I know there's a lot of groups that are working on immigration data on their own and getting through it, and they're pretty accurate. And they're showing some pretty concerning numbers. But one of my biggest focuses this time around with the Trump administration has been kids. We're not talking about migrant children, and they're still separating families, but it's kind of in reverse. Before they were separating families at the border, now they're taking, parents into custody, throwing them in a detention center, then going and snatching their kids and putting those kids in essentially what is the unaccompanied minor program, where they go through, they stay in detention. They can only hold them for like 3 days.
Oh, wow.
Right. And then they move them to like Health and Human Services and the family programs where they have shelters and stuff. And that's where these big facilities that we saw under Trump that were housing tons of kids, in like an abandoned Walmart, for example, that's where those facilities come from. Those are technically, like shelters to keep unaccompanied migrant children. And there was one case that I hunted down because I saw the Venezuelan government was accusing the U.S. of kidnapping Venezuelan kids. So I started looking into it, and sure enough, this is what they were doing. They were separating families as they were being detained, and then they would immediately deport the parents, and then they'd keep the kids in custody for
Mhm.
like 30, 40 something days before sending them back to Venezuela. So they're doing this unnecessary separation and then keeping these families apart, creating trauma for no real reason. And when I started asking DHS and ICE, because I got a list of names from the Venezuelan government, and I had my doubts, of course, right? You got to deal with propaganda all the time. It turned out to be true because, like, I was hounding them for good 10 to 12 days. And then all of a sudden, a flight lands in Venezuela, and there are these 18 kids that they gave me the names for getting off the plane. And I watched the video of them deplaning and being reunited with their families and all these high ranking Venezuelan government officials being there. And I was just blown away that DHS or ICE wouldn't answer any of the questions, wouldn't give me any status, wouldn't give me any idea of the condition of these kids. And
Were
it,
these kids citizens, or are they just?
um, some were to non-citizen parents, but most of them I do not think they were.
Okay.
But there was a good amount that were. I've talked to. There's other cases too, because I've talked to some mothers that were deported to Cuba. I've worked with independent journalists over there in Cuba, and a lot of them, they've talked to a lot of people. Gave me an opening to interview with some of them, and the stories are just terrible because one woman who was abused by her significant other, apparently fought back or whatever, and she was thrown in jail once, and she wasn't charged, but it was just like to separate them, and it shows up as an arrest, and ICE deported her for that and gave her child
She
to
defended herself against her abusive husband.
yeah, and they were separated when she was taken into custody, and they gave the child to the abusive, significant other. I'm not sure if they were married or not, but she was just devastated. And when she said that she was planning on coming back to get her kid, and I don't blame her. That's her kid. And she said she's going to do it as many times as she needs to get her kid back, because she was done pretty dirty. And the more and more you hear about these stories, just the harder it gets,
Yeah.
to see these things. There are, I don't know, we have a pretty big Cuban family. And believe it or not, some of my cousins and stuff are MAGA, and they still don't think that when Donald Trump is calling all immigrants criminals, they don't think they're talking about them. And I'm like, I don't know if you've been paying attention what's going on in Miami, but a lot of Cubans are getting snatched up off the street.
Yeah. I think that they thought they were safe.
Of course, yeah, a lot of them do.
The immigrants. So actually, can I go back, and I wanted to about the program with the
287G, yeah.
287G. I think a lot of people might just look at that, listen to that, and say, "What's wrong with that?" As long as they're helping catch illegal immigrants, and I hear that, and I think those are cops that are going out and getting harmless people that are committed a civil offense, and that's those. It's like the police station gets bigger. It's so those police that were hired to do a job are now doing a different job, and so the job
Right.
they were hired to do can't get done, right? So now you
Right.
don't have people actually, keeping crime off the streets and tracking down real criminals and all of that kind of stuff. It's just taking the police department away, and it's like there's kind of an irony here because these are the same people that were screaming about how bad defund the police is. This is not defund the police in the sense they're still being funded. They're maybe even being better funded, but they're just as available as if they don't exist.
Yeah, so like here in the city of Houston, the Houston Police Department doesn't have a 287G program. And officially, according to the mayor and the police chief, the city and the police department weren't working with ICE. However, case after case, we kept seeing where a police officer pull over somebody who looks illegal, Latino, and they'll call ICE. Okay, so now that cop has to stand there for however long it takes ICE to pull up on the side of the road and check this person's documents. So that cop's not being able to be used elsewhere. You know, and then in a, say, for example, a smaller department, and you have your cops just racially profiling Latinos, they're not paying attention to anything else. You know, they're caught up in all that stuff. It essentially makes your communities less safe.
Yeah.
Another aspect of that is, you know, you have a lot of Latinos, whether citizens or not, afraid to call the police because the police might call ICE and then they get racially profiled. ICE comes, kicks their door down.
Yeah. Right.
You know,
Right.
so, you know, domestic abuse, somebody threatens you with a gun, somebody steals your car, whatever, people are afraid to call the cops. So now you have crime that's not being addressed, right? That's going
Yeah.
unchecked. So that's another aspect of this. You know, so there are a lot of implications, a lot of, you know, it's like a trickle down effect, and it just, it's like they say, shit rolls downhill, right?
Mhm.
And that's kind of what happens. And you know, throwing innocent people who, for example, got into a traffic accident, right? And maybe they have a pending asylum case, you know, to ICE under Trump, whether you're here legally or not doesn't matter. You know, there are case after case where people are like, I'm a legal citizen. Oh, you're lying. Throw them in jail. You show them your ID. That's fake. Throw them in the detention center. So, you know, these people, a lot of these immigrants, you know, you hear a lot of MAGA say, oh, we support legal immigration. Well, right now you're supporting ICE going after people doing it the right way. You know, there was a
They're
recent,
literally snapping people up that are going to their hearings to
right,
do it the right way. And,
right,
you know, like how you can't have that both ways. And also, on another note, like the right way has a systemic racist implication to it. It's like saying I'm, you know, if somebody were to say they were against Jim Crow laws, and you'd be like, I'm for black people voting as long as they do it the right way. You know, I mean,
right,
there's an implication, or there's a veiled racism to the
of
entire
course.
immigration process. And like, just statistically, if you're somewhere else in the world, your chances of being able to immigrate to the United States are 20 times greater if you're a white person than if you're a black
Oh,
person.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah, they'll, I mean, you know, you don't see white immigrants crossing the southern border. It's rare.
yeah.
It's very rare because most of them come in on a visa and then overstay, because that's, I hate to use the word privilege, but that's a privilege because
It's
they know they're
a
not going.
lot easier to get a tourist visa from Germany.
Well, yeah, and then you're not going to be profiled here either.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so it's easier for somebody who overstays a visa to sit here for a year or two without getting caught. And one of the things that never comes up in this conversation about immigration is over 800,000 people from Canada and Europe overstay their visas in the United States every year. Every
Mhm.
year, 800,000 people. So you're worried about the southern border, you know, people from Europe are pouring in through the airports. Um, and nobody ever addresses that. And we know why, you know,
Mhm.
it's obvious. Um, but yeah, you know, these issues, like, a lot of times, you mentioned this earlier, and the term illegal immigrant really irritates me, and I'll explain why. Ask someone to explain what an illegal immigrant is, and they can't tell you. They'll say, oh, somebody who didn't do it the right way. Okay, what's the right way? Explain that to me. Because there are people here who've been in this country for 20, 25 years. They're here legally, but there's no pathway to citizenship for them. You know, they're married, they have kids in college, they have grandkids, they have businesses, they have all these things, but there is no pathway to citizenship for them. You know, you look at, for example, the green card backlog. There's another thing that rarely ever gets discussed. And this
Mhm.
disproportionately impacts Indian immigrants because most of them are here on, you know, visas through the tech sector. And for an Indian immigrant to be able to get a green card, the wait time right now is over 100 years.
Wow. Yeah.
There are 1.8 million people in the green card backlog. 1.3 million are Indian. So, you know, and then there's probably 5 million people in this country who are here legally, like I said, businesses, kids, married, that have no pathway to citizenship. You know, those people, they pay their taxes, they've been doing everything right, they're not criminals, they don't have no criminal record. You know, those kind of people, without something in place for them to give them a pathway to citizenship, they deserve amnesty.
Mhm.
Period. And I know amnesty to a lot of people is a dirty word, but it
Right.
shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
And
Um,
it's better for America to do that.
it
Like
is.
our economy, you know, like they said they're, oh, you know, you would have been for you know, who's gonna pick our cotton, and they use this kind of false nonsense.
Right.
Immigrants have been doing like the bottom rung jobs since America was founded.
Yeah.
And the only thing that changed is what constituted legal, like not the way
Right.
they immigrated. You know, Italian people got on a boat and got off the boat. They didn't like apply for some kind of working visa or something like that.
Right. Right.
The Italian people built the skyscrapers in New York City.
Yeah.
Uh,
You know, there's, and that's the thing, is the way the immigration system has worked in this country historically has been the same. The only thing that changes is the target, right?
yeah,
So, you know, Benjamin Franklin complained about the Germanization of Pennsylvania, right? Because
yeah,
Germans
right.
they wouldn't assimilate, blah, 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 right? We hear all the same things Ben Franklin said, and his biggest fear was the elimination of the white race as we know it, right? And to him,
Yeah,
white was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant from
yeah.
the UK. You know, it's different.
And
Whiteness to him.
he referred to the culture and like
Right, right,
I was actually just thinking about this. You could take Benjamin Franklin and his quotes and just change a word here and there, and it would sound like it was Elon Musk today.
right, exactly. And you know, Benjamin Franklin's fear about the white race was unfounded because here we are 200 whatever 300 years later, because this was all before the Revolutionary War. He talked all his
Yeah,
trash about Germans, and he was an immigrant at the
yeah.
time. So you know, this
He
is
was
that
an
same.
English immigrant.
Right. And this is the whole pull the ladder up behind you thing that we Latinos see all the time.
Yeah,
But like it went from, you know, Germans to Italians to Spaniards to the Irish, right?
yeah,
And then it was the Chinese with the
yeah,
Chinese Exclusion Act, right? And then it just goes down the list nonstop, right? Then it was the Japanese, and then all of a sudden in the 70s it became Latinos, right? And now it's just us all the time, African immigrants, anybody who's not white, right? Because if you're from Europe, they'll let that slide now, but it used to not be that way. There once was a time when, like you said, it was Italians, but then they all became New York City cops, and now they're they're MAGAs. So
now they're all MAGAs. It's
right, they became cops. What do you figure? What do you expect?
and then they say, "Oh, well, you should just come over like, you know, my ancestors did." And it's like they can't come over like your ancestors did. There is literally no real legal process for almost anyone to come over here as a permanent immigrant if they don't have a bachelor's degree.
Right,
Like, and then there are like 40 countries where you can't come over here as a legal immigrant just because of the country you're from.
right,
Like there's and guess what? Every one of those countries is majority person of color countries. Like
right,
your pigment, how much pigment you have really does determine your eligibility to immigrate to the United States. And they don't want to acknowledge that. They just, well, you know, I just think they should do it legally. And they don't know the immigration laws when they say that.
right. They don't know what legally is.
They are.
Right. They don't know what legally is. And that kills me because, you know, if a migrant crosses the border to claim asylum, if they cross the border, walk to a Customs and Border Patrol checkpoint and say they want to claim asylum, that's legal. That's a
Yeah.
legal part of the process.
Yeah.
Um,
And as a matter of fact, it's illegal to not let them do that. Like
right,
the law literally says this is our asylum process. You
right,
can
right.
follow the law, you have to do certain things. And so they would like
Exactly.
to talk about Joe Biden didn't enforce the law. No, Joe Biden did enforce the law. Your problem with him is he enforced the law.
Yeah, and one of the thing, another statistic that people ignore too, especially on the right, was that under Biden, like close to 4 million people were turned away at the border,
Yeah.
even though they were trying to claim asylum, and then you know they do their 3-day vetting process, and then they're sent back across to Mexico.
Yeah.
And you know one of the things too, the one of the biggest driving factors to immigration is U.S. intervention, right? So, the Afghan refugees, that was our fault. Syrians, our fault. Iraq, our fault. Cuba, Venezuela, our fault, right? There's
Right. I think
there's
I
a
think I was reading. I was doing just some study on this. 41 times since 1905 that we have overturned legitimate governments in South America.
Yeah, and I mean we're currently doing it now in Honduras. But the thing, like this whole deal where MAG is obsessed with Venezuelan migrants. What they don't realize is that the mass migration out of Venezuela is mostly Trump's fault.
Yeah.
Because okay, before Trump took office in 2017, maybe 3/4 of a million Venezuelans left after Chavez was elected. Maduro, he died. Maduro took power. Most of them were wealthy Venezuelans. When Trump came down hard and heavy on Cuba and Venezuela, that's when you started seeing these huge numbers out of both countries. And another thing that MAGA doesn't seem to understand is the vast majority of Venezuelans that left Venezuela are still in Latin America. Colombia took in the most at like 1.5 million. And most of them stayed down there, had no interest in coming here. The people who did come here typically come because they already have family here. They have somebody who could sponsor them, and they're not being thrown to the wolves or left out on the street. And I think it's something like just under 18% came here out of the 6 or 8 million that left Venezuela. So it's not as crazy. 20 million people came under Biden. That's not even remotely close.
It's a made up number.
Right. Like even the far right immigration organizations put the number at 13 to 14 million, and that's exaggerated.
Yeah.
They're
using gotaways which is just
right.
that's made up.
Or they count each like apprehension as an individual immigrant, when an apprehension could, one immigrant could account for 4 or 5, not apprehensions, but when they basically make contact with them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like,
right.
What would happen is, like, say I use like just Jose comes over here. Just for anybody that doesn't this, but Jose, they had a program in place during the pandemic where if you came over here, they could just say no, and then you could turn around and go back.
Title 42
with no whatchamacallit, like no records kept or anything like that. Right. So Jose could come over here on Monday and they say, no way, Jose. And so then he goes back, and then he comes back over on Tuesday and they say, no way. And so he comes over 10 times. He actually enters the country 0 times, and they count Jose as 10 different people that are here.
Right. It's 10 different encounters.
Right.
Right. And then, I was also, and I haven't been able to verify this because they don't give you any data anymore out of DHS, but like even like CBP, especially border CBP, and mostly CBP, they will manipulate their numbers to make them seem worse than they are. You can talk to Jen Budd, former Border Patrol agent, all that stuff about this, because this is very well documented. But they will count like moving a person from one facility to another as an encounter. Oh, look, I encountered this migrant as I put him on the bus to send him over there. So each migrant can account for 5 to 10 just because they're being moved around, and they move them around a lot.
They do it deliberately.
Right. So like a lot of the times the data that's being cited by the right and typically with far right, they manipulate data, right? They leave out certain context. They leave out certain things. Like that's where they get all this black on black crime nonsense. And it's mostly just BS because it fits their narrative. It's confirmation bias. And that's all they care about. They want to be able to confirm their bigoted beliefs. So they use whatever data they could find. They don't double check it, stuff like that. So, immigrants in this country commit less crime than citizens do. Immigrants aren't bringing drugs in on their backs. U.S. citizens are doing that. They get caught at points of entry every single day.
90% of the drugs trafficked in the United States are by legal U.S. citizens at point of
entry. Like I get the pressers every day from Border Patrol, from CBP, and every day it's somebody with $2 or $3 million worth of meth, and it's a U.S. citizen coming from Mexico. And one lady one that really stuck out to me was this lady who brought her teenage daughter with her across the border, and she got busted with like $2.5 million worth of meth in her car and her daughter. I'm like, well, the state's going to take your kid, like what a dumb thing to do. And I get the money. The money must be good. That's
And
about all I
it's like if you're the drug cartels,
yeah.
hey, you're not going to try and sneak it in with the legal citizens when you got, Mama Karen and Baby Karen that you got a much better chance of sneaking it over a port of entry through their car than you do trying to sneak it over through
Right.
and
then
somebody's backyard climbing over a wall or something.
Right. Through somebody, yeah. And then you have the shipping container situation, right? Only 3.5% of those are checked by CBP when they come in.
Wow.
Where do you think the real heavy, like massive amounts of drugs are coming from? They're coming from there.
Interesting.
And the logic that CBP uses, or actually it's a federal government kind of policy across the board, is that if they were to check everything, they would disrupt the supply chain. And I'm like, really? Like, did you just admit to putting profit over over stopping drugs from coming in this country? Because that kind of just throws the whole war on drugs out the window, when you do that.
Another thing that's adjacent to all this is I've noticed, maybe something I don't, but I watch, like there's all these videos of them detaining, like the school teacher or the mom that goes to pick up her. I have yet to see any of these ICE raids where they like bust actual cartels or something. Like there are people that are over here illegally that are intending to do crimes and stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't negate that, and I don't think that they shouldn't be
Right.
gone after. But where are the people? It's not that just Donald Trump is not getting the people he said he would get. He's not getting the people he said he was going to get at all.
Right. And that's the thing. Going back to the whole thing about cops not doing their job and crime being run rampant. Homeland Security investigations, ICE, all of them used to partner together with the DEA and stuff and try to take down cartels, to try to take down drug smugglers. Well, now they're all occupied picking up brown people off the street. So, Trump is blowing up boats that can't even make it to the U.S. Meanwhile, containers are flooding in. People are crossing the border in their trucks and cars with stuff, and nothing's being done about that. I've heard things about staffing at the border being minimal because they're using Border Patrol agents to do raids. Like you got Bovino over there trying to be Mr. Big Badass in New Orleans when he's supposed to be at the border stopping stuff. So in these remote areas, there's nobody there. So when Homeland Security says we've seen the lowest number of border crossings, I'm like, yeah, because you're not looking. People are probably crossing over like crazy through the more remote areas because you have nobody there.
Yeah. And then when you've got gotaways as a made up number anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Gotaways has always been an estimate. And it's like for every one, they assume 100 or something. I don't even know what the number is, but it's some stupid ratio like that. Right.
And it's like, it's stupid because it means the more people you catch, the more people are getting away. So if you don't catch anyone, then that means nobody got away.
Right.
But and that would be like, wouldn't that mean the opposite?
Right.
Like,
so
the more people you catch, the fewer are getting away.
That's the thing. It's like they say known gotaways. And I'm like, so what are you saying? You just stood there and watched them cross? Well, there's one, there's two, there's 4 or 5 known gotaways. I just saw them. I'm like, if you knew, why aren't you stopping them? Like,
why aren't you chasing them?
Right. So, there's a lot of, when it comes to far right rhetoric, it's so easy to just clap back on people. I'm like, if they're known gotaways, who saw them? Why didn't they stop them? Why didn't they report them? Like, why didn't they do something? Right. So it doesn't make sense. And I'm with you. Like, I don't negate the fact that there is a criminal element to some of this immigration stuff, right? That's, drugs, cartels, connections, things like that. But, everybody in Texas knows that, sure, meth comes from cartels in Mexico, but the people over here buying it are like the Aryan Brotherhood and shit.
Yeah.
And they're the ones distributing it. And like, people think, oh, there's no way the Aryan Brotherhood would like work a deal with Mexicans. I'm like, yeah, they would. Money's green, bro. Like, they don't give a
Money
damn.
is all that counts with any of it.
Yeah, that's all that matters, bro. They don't give a damn. So,
That's
like,
why I think it's ridiculous that they've been designated as narco-terrorist groups, because they're not politically motivated. It's not like MS-13 has some
right,
political motivation, or any of these
right,
organizations care about politics at all. All they care about is selling drugs and making money. That's
yeah.
their whole.
I mean, if you wanted to label anybody like a narco terrorist, you would have to they would have to be a president, like maybe Noboa in Ecuador, who we just worked out deals with, economic and trade deals with, and like his corporations, like he's the president in Ecuador, right? He's also has a monopoly on the banana industry and a near monopoly on the shipping industry out of Ecuador.
Wow.
Well, in Europe, they keep busting banana shipments from Ecuador filled like with cocaine, and they're tied to the Albanian mafia, whatever. And okay, so Trump wants to tackle narcos, right? And cartels.
Well, here he's pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez.
Right. And then he's working deals with this guy over here in Ecuador, and like letting all these other countries just slide on stuff. And it's brown man in a boat, blow it up. You know what I mean? Like, it's just ridiculous to me.
And so, like, one of the things I've been looking at, like, not that AI is never wrong or anything, but I asked 5 different AIs. If you wanted to stop drug overdoses or lower drug overdoses in the United States, what would your strategy be? Just like made it totally apolitical question. Not one of them, believe it or not one of them said blow up boats off the coast of Venezuela.
Right.
Like, it's wrong on so many levels, even as a strategy. Just like, it doesn't actually fight drugs. What they're doing right now with it's like you said, actually detrimental to combating drugs, because you're taking people away from their jobs to go and do these frivolous things.
Yeah, and then if you're not going to treat the drug addiction problem, right? So one of the things that I always say, and because it's largely true, is our drug problem, and even with alcohol, people do drugs and drink as a coping mechanism, right? A lot of the people that do drugs are probably poor, homeless, struggling through life. Like, solve that problem. Why do people shouldn't have to cope with their life every day? People should be able to just live it, and if you don't address that underlying issue, which is like crime, connected to poverty, you have crimes of desperation, there's so many issues that need to be addressed before you start blowing up boats in the water. If you tried to actually tackle the drug problem in the US, you would undermine the cartels, right?
Yeah.
For example, like, even if, like, in Texas, they're trying to ban weed, right? For example, I mean, just legalize that shit. That takes one product out of the cartel's catalog. They won't be able to sell you any more weed because we can get it anywhere we want now. While that may be sort of true with other drugs like cocaine and shit, I don't know that I recommend legalizing cocaine. You know what I mean? But I think if we address the problem, though, where people don't feel the need to just cope.
Addiction and
right.
Like, actually do things from, like, that was actually the number one thing on every single AI was treat the demand first, not the supply.
Right.
Like, if people don't want cocaine, if people don't want fentanyl, you're not going to sell it to them. And
right. I mean, as long as there's a demand, there will always be a supply.
Yeah.
And these cartels, we heard this a lot after 9/11. Like, you take out a leader of a terrorist organization like Al Qaeda, and then all of a sudden it splinters into 10 more, and now you have 10 terrorist leaders instead of one. It's the same with cartels. You know what I mean? You take out El Chapo, and then next thing you know, you have his sicarios and the small gang, and everybody fractures, and now you have this war of everybody trying to take over El Chapo's trafficking routes. And until you
that's like actually the Sinaloa cartel, right? The same one that Juan Orlando Hernandez was working with.
Right. Well,
the one that Donald Trump gave his gave El Chapo's son the sweetheart deal to bring up 17 of his family members.
Yeah,
Also,
right.
by the way, the Binance guy that got convicted, he was the one that the Chinese, I can't think of his name, Chow, I think.
You
But
talking about the fentanyl guy?
the guy that there was a guy that he was a Binance, he's a crypto guy
Oh, yeah.
that was laundering money for the Sinaloa cartel. So
Right.
anyway, I just noticed there's all these buddies of the Sinaloa cartel that Donald Trump has been really friendly to.
Yeah,
So,
and a lot of it, and this came up and is coming up now in this whole Honduras election situation, which is a huge debacle because we got caught meddling in that election. The United States did.
yeah.
But now there is cartel involvement in some of these electoral results that are questionable. Like 14% of these tally sheets and ballots are, all questionable, not valid, and now there's all this involvement about cartels being involved in these elections, trying to swing certain areas in Honduras. And I wrote about how maybe about a month ago about how with the United States, it's not necessarily about taking out the drug cartels, it's about controlling the trafficking networks. And when you consider, and I looked as far back in history as I could, and this went all the way to Vietnam, the CIA and all these other organizations have been running drugs. Like in Vietnam, they ran heroin to our troops in Vietnam while smuggling it to the United States. In the 90s in Venezuela, their drug interdiction team interdicted I can't remember what it was, like $20 million worth of cocaine. And I always wondered why the U.S. demands that we turn over these drugs to the United States, that Latin America turns these drugs over to the United States to be destroyed. Well, I was kind of shed some light on that when I found that the CIA went down there. The DEA was supposed to get these drugs from.
I heard they're going to make Donald Trump Jr. in charge of destroying all the coke.
Yeah, he probably will too. But they the DEA was supposed to get the hold of these drugs. The CIA got to them first. The CIA, for whatever reason, wanted to smuggle them into the United States.
Wow.
Instead of just putting it on a DE plane, flying it in. Their agents, their CIA personnel got caught at the Miami International Airport by Customs and Border Patrol, bringing in 2, 3, 4 kilos of cocaine at a time. And the only thing that came out of that as a result is the CIA director said, we had a couple of agents who made a bad judgment. One dude resigned and another one got reassigned somewhere else. Nobody was charged.
The whole thing in the 80s with the Iran controversy.
Right. And it just continues.
Yeah.
And then I talked to a guy recently who sent me some pictures, and there's a lot to validate here, but in another country in Latin America where pallets of cocaine looked like aid, like USAID aid, were on an Air Force jet being shipped out of the country into the US clandestinely. It wasn't openly transferred over to the DEA like it should be. And like there's so many weird instances like this. And when you consider that the United States military has been operating out of like 8 different Colombian bases to help with the drug trafficking thing since the 90s, and cocaine trafficking has tripled in that time, it really makes you wonder. It really makes you wonder.
And I think it's like 84% of the cocaine in the world starts from Colombia.
Right. And it's crazy because a lot of people talk about Colombia, but Peru's in there on that too. There's a lot of countries involved in this, but yeah, no, Colombia for sure, still takes the cake as far as, the amount of cocaine produced in the world. But again, as long as there's demand, there will always be supply.
Right.
And plain and simple, and then targeting Venezuela, which is in comparison to Ecuador or Colombia or anybody else, is really negligible as far as drug trafficking routes go.
Yeah.
Because it's really not in a good location for that. To target them and not, bigger actual cartels instead of inventing something, it just really speaks to what the true motivations must be with Venezuela. And it's clearly not drugs, it's greed.
Yeah.
It's greed. And It's
So
not
what do you
just
think that? Okay, so like steering to Venezuela here, because I think we hear a lot about Venezuela. I don't think the average American really understands anything at all about what happened there. Like with the election that was stolen, and I believe even
supposedly.
that under Biden recognized that the thing was stolen. It's not like this is one of those things where like Trump says it was stolen and Biden said it was stolen, but Biden was like install the guy that won, and Trump is like install the guy that I want installed.
Yeah, the thing is, like with that election, there was a key little disclaimer that was like buried deep in the Washington Post and the AP articles that analyzed the election data. First of all, you have to question how two news outlets can analyze 20,000, 30,000 tally sheets in 24 hours. It took me 2 months to go through about 10 or 11,000 of them. And a lot of that data that the opposition turned over to the Washington Post and the AP is no good. Like there are obvious forged signatures. None of those tally sheets have been certified. Therefore, they can't be validated. I'm not saying Nicolas Maduro won the election, but I'm not saying he lost either. Like, I don't know. I don't know who won that election. And for anybody to outright say that he lost and he refused to leave is kind of disingenuous, because you look at Honduras right now. And it's a perfect example of how the U.S. can manipulate elections in other countries.
So it could just be that a different guy was trying to. Well, even like
Yeah.
the U.S. has been trying to control.
Oh yeah.
In politics. Like I was saying on Twitter yesterday, if we don't want refugees, maybe we should stop creating them. Like,
Right, and that's what it boils down to. That's truly what it boils down to. If the U.S. attacks Venezuela, particularly a ground invasion, that one, it's not going to end well. Two, it's going to destabilize an entire region. If you think there was a mass migration problem before, it's going to be worse this time. Whether it's people migrating around in Latin America, up into Central America, or coming here or going to Canada, the situation is going to be much worse. And it's just that doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit Venezuelans. It doesn't benefit Colombians, and it doesn't benefit anybody here in the United States. It will benefit, the CEOs at Chevron and ExxonMobil and all the U.S. corporate interests. They'll get richer, just like they did in Iraq, through Halliburton and stuff. But it's not going to do
donated $450 million to Trump's campaign, by the way. Not
Right.
like that. But you've got Venezuela has like the largest oil reserve in the world. But you were mentioning on your Substack, it may not just be about oil. There's other things that they have.
Sure. Yeah, there been a few heads at Southern Command, Southcom, which oversees Latin America, that have mentioned different resources that are available in Latin America and particularly in Venezuela. And the one that stuck out to me the most a few years ago was they kept mentioning fresh water. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. What are they going to do? Ship water from there to here? That doesn't. And now it does, because Maria Corina Machado has been real big on trying to convince all these data companies that they should bring their data centers to Venezuela because they have so much fresh water. Venezuela has vast amounts of gold. Eric Prince, Blackwater, refers to Venezuela as El Dorado for a reason, and that's because of gold and oil. They also have, lithium, bauxite, nickel. There's all these different resources that are just big money makers for corporations here in the U.S. And why pay top dollar when you can just go in there and steal it? And that's kind of where we're at. Because if you took all the sanctions off Venezuela right now, not only would it begin to prosper, but a lot of U.S. interests would be making deals with Maduro and with his government. Because at the end of the day, they don't care. They'll have to pay, market share or some negotiated wholesale price or something like that. But when it comes to court, they don't care. I mean, they did business with Pinochet, who was a dictator in Latin America. They've done business with, Batista, who was the dictator before Castro in Cuba, with all those connections to the mafia and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's
You
the
got
US
Donald Trump putting us 50% tariff on Brazil because
Right.
they're prosecuting
Bolsonaro.
Bolsonaro. Yeah.
Yeah, and that guy, and that's the thing. Bolsonaro was a Christian nationalist, a white Christian nationalist at that, in Brazil of all places. And Malays the same way. Like the whole idea is to take away all the rights that have been granted to indigenous people, to black people in Latin America. One of the reasons why, some people in Venezuela, they might not be a fan of Maduro, but they reminisce about Chavez because the constitution that was put in place under Chavez recognizes indigenous people and black people and recognizes their plight and puts systems in place to try to help them. And even though, like, I've seen people, I think it was Breakthrough News was going through and talking to a lot of the black Venezuelans in poor communities and stuff like that, and they're like, yeah, the situation here sucks, but at least we feel seen, at least we feel represented, at least there's that. We didn't have that before. And a lot of people, they support that. They don't necessarily support Maduro. They don't necessarily support the current government. But when you have somebody like Maria Corina Machado, who was part of trying to coup Chavez in 2002, and she was part of throwing their constitution out, that was the first thing they did. That's the reason why that coup only lasted 48 hours. Because you just threw representation for the majority of the population out the window. And people don't realize that there are a lot of white Venezuelans, but Venezuela is mostly indigenous and a decent population of black Venezuelans. So, there's a lot of things, like when you're trying to get involved in another country's internal affairs, if you're not willing to address those things and you keep talking about, we're just going to throw all these things out the window and you no longer have representation, there's a reason why Maria Corina Machado polls so lowly in approvals, and like most Venezuelans hate her, and it's not even close. Edmundo Gonzalez, the guy who supposedly won the last election, I know the New York Times tried to paint him as a saint and a cat lover, and he's just old grandpa, but that dude was involved in some pretty violent stuff in El Salvador. And yeah, most of his ties are to a lot of anti-government stuff from El Salvador back in the day. Maria Corina Machado, same thing. They have direct ties to a lot of militant far-right organizations in Argentina and El Salvador. So the whole far-right position that Machado and Gonzalez represent is not one that's very popular anywhere in Latin America for the most part. And the other thing that, when it comes to the election, and I just want to throw this in there, another thing that people overlook is that there were 10 candidates in that last election. Our media doesn't talk about the other 9, right? They only talk about the other 8. They talk about Maduro and they talk about Gonzalez. And one of the things that stick out to me was all these other 9 candidates, and probably more than half are anti-Maduro, right? There's a lot of opposition to the government in Venezuela and the legislature and stuff like that. 9 out of the 10 parties validated Maduro's results for the last election. The only ones that refused to or be a part of the process of validating the election was Maria Corina Machado and Gonzalez. And there's a lot of context there that's being left out. And I think, honestly, if the Washington Post and the Associated Press put at the very top of their article that we were unable to validate these tally sheets as authentic, everybody would have a different opinion about that last election. I'm not saying everybody would say Maduro won, but probably more people would be sitting here like me going, I have no freaking idea who won. I really don't, because we didn't see results from Maduro, and the stuff we saw from the opposition was really shady. So yeah, it's
so you can't say for sure that he won, but you can't say for sure he lost either.
No, and one thing I will say right now is that the United States has done more to unite Venezuela behind that guy. And I don't even like that guy. They've done more to unite Venezuela behind Maduro than anything else in the last decade.
Yeah, and it's like I saw there's one of the crazy MAGA congresswomen, can't remember her name, but she was like sitting there saying, like, like talking about his popularity, and it's like it's not like there's two choices. Either
Right.
we keep him, or the U.S. invades the country. Like, I think invasion by the USA would be a different, would not be like the alternative that people would choose. Even
Yeah,
the white
it's true. Like in Venezuela, if most people hated Maduro, they're going to hate U.S. interventionism more. Venezuela just recently celebrated, I think it was its 218th anniversary of independence from Spain, right? The Bolivarian Revolution. They take pride in their Independence Day just like we do.
Mhm.
And if somebody came and tried to invade this country tomorrow, nobody's going to care who the president is. I'm going to pick up a gun and defend my shit. I'm going to defend my family. I'm going to defend, that's what's going to happen in Venezuela, right? They're really proud of their independence. They're proud of how they achieved it. The Bolivarian Revolution is a really big thing in their history. And
It's
you're just
amazing
not
how many Americans don't understand that
right.
people from other countries can love
Right.
their country. Like,
Right.
I had it when I lived in Italy when I was in my 20s. I was in the Air Force, and I had a friend, and we went out one day, and he said, "Kelly, why do Americans think they're the only ones that can love their country?" And I had never thought about it before. I was like 21.
Yeah.
I honestly just have to say we're stupid. Like, we don't
You
think
know,
about that. Like the Donald Trump is sitting there telling every other country in the world to put America first.
yeah. It's like Vietnam, right? You had Buddhists taking side with the communists because they didn't want a bunch of gringos on their land, right?
Yeah.
We have our problems. Let us deal with our problems. And that's essentially the message that they're trying to send. You're going to have that same problem in Venezuela, right? You might take Maduro out, but if you do, you're going to create a huge power vacuum, and you're going to end up in an Afghanistan situation, an Iraq situation. You're going to be there for 20 years. You're going to leave, and the revolution's going to take back over. And that's basically what's going to happen. There's no path to victory in Venezuela. And
Well, if I were to like give you authority over this situation, and you were to what would you do to like restore peace there?
so my position on all these things is I don't support any world leaders, right? Personally, I'm not a fan of Maduro. I'm not a fan necessarily of people in the Cuban government, but I support the people of that country, right? If they want Maduro in office, hey, you can have him. I don't have to like the guy, right?
Mhm.
I don't have to deal with him. It's not my problem. So why are we starving millions of people because of this one guy, right? We've been doing it to Cuba for 65 years. We've been doing it to Venezuela for close to 20. Why are we doing this to them, right? And it doesn't make any sense because as many times as the U.S. has been involved in a coup, the Venezuelan people have rejected that coup. So they're willing to deal with their internal problems on their own.
Mhm.
Me personally, I would lift sanctions. I would let these people live the way. If you want people on your side, the last thing you do is starve them. You
Mhm.
give them opportunity. You show them. If you think capitalism is the way for Venezuela, show them that. Prove if you think socialism is going to fail, let it fail. Don't sanction it. If Cuba was a failed state, why are you sanctioning the daylights out of it? Let it fail. The people will address the situation as needed. In Cuba, Venezuela before they were liberated, same thing. You had brutal dictatorships.
And
You had
it's never the dictators that suffer
right,
these things,
right,
right? Like
never
all the sanctions in the world, and Putin is probably even
right,
richer than Elon Musk, right? Like,
right.
he's not suffering.
No,
Everybody else suffers.
right, and whatever you can say about Maduro, he's not suffering either.
Mhm.
He lives in the presidential palace. He has security. He gets food before anybody else does. I mean, that's how leadership in every country is, right? We have Trump in the White House. He eats the best of the best. He hangs out with the richest and blah blah blah. that's the same in every country, right? It kind of goes without saying. But, you know, starving people to try to convince them, let's just make them suffer, they'll overthrow the government. No, dude, that's not how that works. You know, you want to get rid of that government, you need to prove people to people that a different way exists and it's better.
So Rasta Pasta says you will never be able to justify socialism. The West, we are so against that. And I think your argument is we don't need to convince them. If it's that bad, let them have their socialist government.
Right.
Let it fail, and then they will convince themselves. It's
Right.
not our job to
Right.
convince people whether it's good or bad.
If the people of a country choose to be communist, fuck it, that's their issue, man. That's not my problem. You know what I mean? I gotta feed my kids. I got rent to pay. I got bills to pay. I got my cell phone bill. You know what I mean? I got my own issues. I can't be worried about somebody 1,000 miles away deciding to run their government differently. You know, convince Venezuelans and Cubans that they should throw away their health care and their housing and all these things the government gives them for the benefit of U.S. corporations. Try to convince them of that. And I'd like to see how that works, because I talk to Venezuelans, I talk to Cubans, I talk to people all over the place. And if you're not willing to address their specific needs, then you're not having a conversation. You're being domineering, right? You're trying to dominate the conversation. You're not trying to convince them that your way is better. You're just telling them that your way is better. And the fact is, every Cuban that ever comes to this country, their first reaction is, I cannot believe there are homeless people on the street in the richest country in the world. There are no homeless people in Cuba. There are very few. If you find any, there's going to be few. And that's one of the biggest shocks to people when they come here from other countries. You know, a lot of people in Latin America will tell you, yeah, sure, in the United States you have access to everything, but what's the point in having access to it if you can't afford it? That's not real access. You know, if somebody's too poor to have cable TV or pay for internet, that's not access. You know what I'm saying? And that for a lot of people, that's the case. If somebody like me, who has to decide sometimes between my prescriptions at the end of the month or groceries, that's not access. You know, I'm trying to decide whether I need my meds or do I eat. That's an issue.
So you have freedom to have either, but you don't have freedom to have both. Because
right.
you don't have.
The thing about it is like you can have socialist type policies in a capitalist country and still be a capitalist country. It's not socialism, right? We're not seizing the means of production of everything. Although I will say that as a taxpayer, if I paid money to build an electrical grid or to build the telephone system, which we did do, we shouldn't have to pay a private company and somebody shouldn't be able to profit from that. If you and I and everybody else in this country paid for the electrical grid, that's ours. That belongs to the people. Our electric bills should be to maintain it and pay people's salaries to work on the grid. There shouldn't be a profit motive in between, because that's where we get screwed. Your water infrastructure we paid for, sewer infrastructure we paid for. Why is a third party profiting off of it? You want to talk about socialism? Let's just talk about reality. Let's talk about the fact that we pay drug companies money, taxpayer dollars, to do research, to create new drugs that they later put back on the market and charge us for. Like, we paid to invent the drug. They pay to manufacture it and distribute it. Okay, I'll pay you for the manufacturing and distributing, but that's it. You know, that's it. Like, why are we paying you for creating? We paid you for it already. You know, I pay to build a highway. Now I got to pay a toll to drive on it. This is it's the industrialization of everything. This started happening after World War II. Healthcare was industrialized because they saw that the war machine could be industrialized and profit could be made. And they industrialized healthcare. Then they industrialized, everything else down the line. And now you have, thousands of middlemen in between you and your healthcare that are making a profit. And then they decide what kind of healthcare you get. It doesn't make sense. So I don't need to convince anybody about socialism, because this isn't socialism. I'm not talking about going into Ford and seizing the means of production at Ford. I'm talking about critical infrastructure that we pay for, that we built, and then we have to continue to pay for it until the day we die. It doesn't make sense to do that. And when you try to convince a Cuban, for example, or Venezuelan who pays 50 cents to ride a train 20 miles, or ride the, whatever for free, that they have to start paying $10 to ride that train because now there's 3 people in the middle making a profit, you're just not going to sell them on that idea. That's where Maria Corina Machado fails. She says, all these people, there's trillions of dollars to be made for U.S. corporations. Venezuelan people do not want to hear that. They do not want to hear that U.S. corporations are about to come in here and profit off of something that we pay pennies for.
Yeah, right.
Not right. You know what I mean? So
Uh-huh.
it doesn't make sense. Let other countries
She's
govern.
trying to basically ask U.S. corporations to buy her,
Right. And
and then she gets the benefit at the expense of every. But your main argument here is not so much about whether socialism is good or bad, but whether or not Venezuela should have the autonomy from the United States to determine what it wants, right?
Right.
Like you said, if they decide they want Machado, let them have Machado.
Right, let them have her.
Decide they want socialism, let them have socialism. If they
I don't
have something in between, let them have something in between. But we're so busy trying to manipulate every government in Latin America to what we feel is the best for U.S. corporations, that it's actually causing all the problems that are in South America.
Right. We're spending too much time dictating and not enough time listening. And at the end of the day, you see 25% of our Navy in the Caribbean, dude. Like, who in the Caribbean is a threat to the United States at that level? You took the world's largest aircraft carrier, because the media won't stop telling us that. You took it out of the Mediterranean and brought it here. What did you just leave vulnerable?
Yeah.
Like 25% of our Navy is in a puddle in comparison to the rest of the world. And it just doesn't make any sense. But then when you look at a map and you just go from Florida to Cuba to Venezuela, you start to see that the United States could shut off the Gulf of Mexico if they had control of those 3 countries, if they had control of those 2, Cuba and Venezuela. And then you could really starve Latin America. Then you could really put the pinch on them, because, Guyana's already a neighbor. They're south of, or an ally. They're south of Venezuela. So, how do you get anything done if the U.S. controls access to that? Just like we try to want to maintain control of the Panama Canal. Same thing. We want to be able to dictate who can and can't go through there. Panama is not like that. If a Chinese ship comes through there, Iranian boat comes through there, they let it go through there.
Yeah.
As long as they pay the fee, and, they're Switzerland in that regard,
Yeah.
So it's just, it's, to me, the only thing I can see aside from the greed is the strategic hold we can have if we had control of Cuba and Venezuela. Like, we could,
like, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, right? Like,
right.
We essentially feel like all of South America belongs to us. They exist to, for our own personal wealth transfer.
Yeah, and it's funny because I just wrote something about the Monroe Doctrine, and it comes up a lot in work, and when you're doing any work about Latin America, because it's hard not to. But on December 2nd, there's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, from 1904 or 1905. And then on December 2nd, Trump issued his own corollary. So the Monroe Doctrine initially started as a speech to Congress from the president.
Mm-hmm.
The Roosevelt corollary, a speech to Congress
for those that don't know, can you?
Yeah, I'll explain it. And then
just a bit. Yeah.
So the Monroe Doctrine, like you said, the Monroe Doctrine pushed European nations out of Latin America. This was, after Spain was overthrown in several countries. And the real goal of the Monroe Doctrine was to get Spain out more than anybody else.
They would, they said any attack on anywhere in the Western Hemisphere was an attack on the United States.
Right. That's essentially what that was. There's caveats in there that say that we also can, make a move on any country in Latin America that's, essentially being corrupt, doing whatever, right? It essentially opened the door for us to be able to just create narratives, convince the public, and be like, okay, let's go. The Roosevelt corollary came about when some European nations wanted to collect on some debts in Latin America, and Latin American countries couldn't pay. So they were going to do it by force. And then you had the British, Germans, and Italians blockaded Venezuela. 1902, somewhere in there. The U.S., took offense to that. Hey, like, hey, Monroe Doctrine, you guys need to get out of here. The Roosevelt corollary essentially addresses that, forcing them, like, you can't bring military might over here. The whole thing was there was an issue about waning influence in the region. And that's typically what provokes these doctrines, is waning influence. So Trump issues one December 2nd, essentially just, it wasn't a speech to Congress. It was a whole 350 words on the website. You know what I mean? It's nothing compared to the corollaries and all the stuff that came before. But he's just reemphasizing control over Latin America. Mentions the whole thing about the cartels and tackling drug trafficking, which we just discussed is all BS. And essentially it's just reaffirming the White House's position right now, which kind of explains what it's doing with all these boats in the Caribbean, and that's to assert dominion over Latin America, control. That's where the threats against Gustavo Petro in Colombia come from. Trump is actively and openly threatening respected elected leaders in Latin America, threatening to overthrow elected leaders, and is attempting an electoral coup in Honduras as we speak. So,
he's basically giving himself veto power over every country in the Western Hemisphere.
Basically, right. And he has the support of Javier Milei in Argentina, Nayib Bukele, who doesn't really have as much power in Latin America because he's in a very small country, and he's kind of laughed at a little bit because of his arrogance and stuff. But yeah, you have a couple of leaders, I believe Paraguay, a couple of countries that are, far right governments in Latin America that support what Trump is doing. Made me think, because of the guy who said you can't convince the West on socialism. There are a lot of far right countries in Latin America who have universal health care for their citizens. Every country in Latin America has some form of health care for their people. This came up in a conversation when Bernie Sanders was talking about how medical bankruptcies are unheard of in all these socialist democratic countries in Europe. They're unheard of in the world. Like, most of the world does not know what medical bankruptcy is.
Yeah, we're about the only country,
us in Canada,
that except, I don't know, maybe some countries that are like really, really poor, but we're the only country where we ration healthcare based on income status, like, and based on employment status. Like, if you work for the right company and make enough money, you have insurance. We're the only ones that do that. Nobody else does that.
And here's the thing,
and we're like, oh, everybody else in the world is extremists. We're the moderates. Like, maybe if everybody else to the world is to the left of you, you're too far to the right.
Right. And a lot of these countries, in Mexico, Venezuela, a lot of places, they have trouble getting medical care out to rural areas and stuff. And I'll accept that. They're not perfect, flawless systems, but
we have systems closing down.
Yeah, and I mean, we're losing hospitals in rural areas everywhere. But the thing is, like, Bernie Sanders likes to compare ourselves to other, developed so-called rich countries, right, in Europe. And yeah, sure, that sends a message. In my opinion, the bigger message is if a poor, quote unquote, poor country, so-called third world country, can afford health care for their people and put their people first, what the hell are we doing? We're the richest country in the world. How is it Name a country in Latin America. I would say Cuba, but people always bitch about Cuba. I would say Venezuela, but people complain about that. Let's talk about
Brazil.
Argentina. Let's talk about Paraguay. Far right governments.
Yeah.
These are, I mean, practically Christian nationalists. El Salvador, Uruguay has, or Costa Rica has the longest life expectancy in the region. Free healthcare. What the hell? You know what I mean? Costa Rica's GDP is nothing compared to ours. Their accumulated wealth is nothing compared to ours. But you know what? Their debt per capita is nothing compared to ours. You know, people aren't going bankrupt over their health care.
Just to
And
be clear for Rasta Pasta here, you're not defending the Cuban government, right? Like you said, your own family is immigrated.
yeah, my whole family's Cuban. I have a lot of I have a lot of family that still live in Cuba that support the government. They want reforms. You know, they're not interested in a civil war with their neighbors and destabilization and all that. They want sanctions lifted. They want to reform their government. They don't necessarily want to get rid of it. I mean, you know, a lot of people don't think they have elections in Cuba, but they do. They do. And I don't like I said earlier, I don't support any government. I support the people of a country. So if Cuba wants to be communist, fucking let them be communist. If Venezuela wants to be socialist, let them be socialist. It's none of my business. I don't have to deal with those people. I don't have to like Nicolas Maduro. I don't like Nicolas Maduro, but he's not my problem. You know what I mean? Just because I don't like him doesn't mean I'm not going to report the whole story, right? So, you know, if the last election is questionable on both sides, we need to be having that questionable on both sides conversation.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be supporting and sort of driving this false narrative that Maduro lost the election because we don't know that he did. There's not enough data to confirm or deny it either way.
So it's
And
just like the Honduras election right now.
right now, it's up in the air.
Not that we know who won and who lost, or it's the wrong. It's that we messed up everything so bad we don't know who
Right,
was winning or losing or anything.
right.
Like
We don't.
so convoluted. There's no way to know.
Right. I mean, Hondurans don't even know yet, and it's been a slow going process, and you know they're starting to find all these ballots and tally sheets that are questionable, and they're doing hand counts because, like in Honduras, like us, nobody trusts the electronic voting systems. Right? Everybody has questions about people want hand counts. I'm all for that, man. Count
Yeah.
them, count those paper ballots.
So just for Rasta, I think what he's saying is exactly what you're saying. He's saying that's why we need to get out of Venezuela's business.
Oh yeah.
Let Venezuela run Venezuela and let U.S. corporations stay out of it. I think you're actually agreeing with him without realizing it.
I think so. I think, and it seems that way. It seems that way because I don't know, like right now, like Nicolas Maduro, for example, in Venezuela, opened up Venezuela to foreign oil companies, right? The thing is, the way sanctions work is if an oil company wants to move oil out of Venezuela, they need to have a license from the United States. And at the end of the day, you have to stop and think, who's the United States to tell people they can or can't buy from Venezuela, right? Who's the United States to tell me I can't send money to my family in Cuba? That's not freedom, bro. If I want to send money to my family in Cuba, I should be able to do that without having to receive some sort of headache or a phone call from some, government agency about me supporting the Cuban government. What? No, dude. These people need groceries or they need to pay a bill. They need to do something, fix the car. Let me send them money. What's the problem? That's not freedom. If you're telling like farmers in the US, they all want to do business with Cuba. Cuba needs to be able to do business with US farmers. The US government won't let them. Any farmer will tell you that is not freedom. If they want to go do business with Cuba, they should be allowed to. I mean, what's the difference? Cuba or Vietnam is a communist country. China is a communist country. We do tons of business with them. What's the big deal about 10 million people right here? China's got 2 billion. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. At the end of the day, it's about control. They want control over these countries. They want to be able to dictate how things operate. They want Cuba to be a playground. They want Venezuela to be a bank account, that kind of stuff. And it's just a lot of it is nonsensical. It really isn't. It really isn't. We fought an entire war for I don't even know how many damn years in Vietnam to walk away, and the communists still there. and now we're doing business with them. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan to walk away, and what? It's just like it was 20 years ago. The Taliban's in control. Like,
How
what
much
was
money did we spend on that?
I mean, ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't. To attack Venezuela at this point, it's just going to be another Vietnam, Afghanistan type quagmire. You're going to end up walking away, and it's going to go right back to what it was. Because if that's what the people,
no reason to do it,
right?
None whatsoever.
We were at the end of the day, and I don't want to blame Afghans, and I sure as hell ain't defending the fucking Taliban, right? But dude, we were there for 20 years. If the Afghans wanted to get rid of the Taliban, that was the window to do it. And they didn't. That tells me maybe the Taliban wasn't as bad as they don't think the Taliban is as bad as we think it is. I think they're horrible, right? That's me, but I don't have to like them. I'm here, they're there. You know what I mean? Other countries can govern however they want. One thing is for sure, governing the way we govern, just look around, man. Look around. It is not perfect. Not even close. Like, look at where we are. Fascism creeping in, all this stuff. ICE kicking down doors without warrants and snatching people off the street. Come on, man. We're not the ideal solution here. And one of the things that irritates me the most and people tend to overlook is we always like to say we're the beacon of democracy, the beacon of freedom, and this, that, and the other. But then we fund a genocide, let people bomb civilian areas, right? And then we want to pretend to be outraged because Russia's doing it. When all Russia can do is, look, the beacon of democracy and the beacon of freedom does it too. Why can't we?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? That duplicity really works against us.
And it kind of makes it hard to like.
Yeah.
And it's not that defending the democracy in Ukraine is wrong. It's
right.
The genocide in Gaza is wrong, but it takes the teeth out of our protest for Ukraine when we are, funding the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, it really does. And I think that if you really want to hold truth to power in this country, you have to call that stuff out. And you just don't see a lot of that in DC. I've worked with a lot of journalists in DC when I was working with Pablo at Capitol Press, and there's a lot of reluctance to essentially talk shit to lawmakers, right? Everybody's afraid of losing access to them. My position is anybody who's in elected office needs me more than I need them. They need the media more than the media needs them, right? If the media just quit going to their offices tomorrow, them dudes would be picking up the phone, calling the New York Times, calling MSNBC, calling everybody like, hey, we need to get this message out. So like I talk trash about a lot of people, lawmakers in Congress, they still talk to me, and I don't get why people don't take, or journalists don't take more of a hardline approach with everyone in general, because, guys like this, I use the term duplicity a lot as opposed to hypocrisy, because, you see a guy like Jeffries, you see a guy like Tom Cotton, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. They're all pretty duplicitous in what they say and then what they do. So it's really a tough thing to try to have a debate with somebody over a country like Venezuela or Cuba or whatever, when all they know is what they've been told, right? And they haven't tried to diverge away from that. They haven't tried to look at things differently. If the only Cubans you talk to are the white Cubans who fled when Castro desegregated the island, you're not getting not even a quarter of the story. They fled when they desegregated the island for a reason. I call it the white flight out of Cuba because that's basically what it was, and until you address these things that, yeah, sure, Cuba's poor, Cuba struggles, this, that, and the other. You know what? Black Cubans and the indigenous Cubans are no longer on the fringes of society. You see them in Havana. And when you look at Havana now, you start to realize just how black Cuba is. It's a former slave colony. Of course it's that way. People always assumed Cuba was white because all the black people were stuck on the fringes of society.
Cubans don't look like Marco Rubio?
Man, the vast majority don't. Like recent studies say Cuba's as like 62%, 63% black.
Wow.
And it makes sense when you consider how many generations of white flight from 1959, how many generations of white people are no longer in Cuba that used to be. So now the white population in Cuba, there's this there's this thing. If you try to say you're white, most people will be like, show me a picture of your grandma. They will laugh in your face because whiteness is dumb. It's bullshit. They don't believe it. Like there's no, you're either from Spain or you're Yoruban. Like most of my family, mostly Afro-Cuban from the Yoruban area of Africa. They work the fields. My white side comes from the Portuguese who migrated to Cuba in the late 1800s to work the fields. That's how most of my family is black, because we work side by side in the fields, or my ancestors did. So yeah, it's a lot of people don't know these little nuances about Cuba or about any other foreign country. And like you said, they treat it like somehow we're the only ones that love our country in the United States. Like our freedom is the only type of freedom. And that's questionable when my government tells me I can't send money somewhere, or I can't do business with somebody or something because they're in this country, not necessarily a part of the government. But I can't invest in a mom and pop restaurant in Cuba or a mom and pop little grocery store in Cuba because it's not allowed. And that doesn't make sense to me. And they say it's not allowed because the Cuban government benefits from it. Well, of course they do. Tax revenue. That's what right? Like you do business in the U.S. government benefits from it, from your tax revenue.
And so does the mom and pop shop.
Right.
And the ones that hurt the most are the ones that need it the most.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just strange to me, the logic and the things that go into how we operate overseas.
And I think the logic, what there is of it, is if they put sanctions on and they make the people unhappy enough, the people will rise up and overthrow but you're actually making things harder for the people, making it harder for them to rise up because they have to work harder to make a living. And it's not like the people, like they're going to blame it on the Americans.
Right.
Like they're not going to blame it on the government. They're going to blame it on the Americans because the Americans are the ones that are causing the problem.
Yeah, well, like a lot of people, like in Cuba, they'll tell you, government has a lot of problems over there, right? Which government doesn't, right? But they'll also say their situation has made, exponentially worse by the embargo, by the sanctions. And again, you're just not going to get people on your side if you're starving them.
Yeah.
How are you going to get people to be like, yeah, let's fight for U.S. corporate interests when they're starving us? No, that's just not going to happen.
Twist your arm hard enough, you'll slap your mama. Like,
right? No, not happening. You're gonna have to break my arm, bro, because I'm not slapping my mom.
It's just that's the logic, isn't it? Like,
yeah,
if I hurt you, you will eventually hurt someone else.
Yeah, it's just crazy to me, man. Yeah, I don't. It just doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. And these hardliners, like the Maria Elvira Salazar, she's that hardline anti-Cuban lady in Congress. She's representative for part of Miami. She's isn't like that just with Cuba. She's part of the reason why people are casting doubts in the elections in Honduras. She held a whole subcommittee hearing about the Honduran elections, broadcast it into Honduras. And thank God for Joaquin Castro, who was there, who called out one of her witnesses, who's a registered foreign agent with tons of business interests in Honduras. And he spent his whole 5 minutes just roasting this guy about his conflicts of interest. And it said so much about that hearing. And I'm glad it was broadcast in Honduras so people can see just how much of a scam that hearing was. And then you have Trump, getting involved in that election, and it's just ridiculous. So you have a lot of these Cuban hardliners, and they go after Venezuela, and they go after Honduras, and they go after Guatemala and Nicaragua, and in those countries, they're like, man, shut the hell up. You're Cuban. Don't talk to us about, our problems. You know, like it's just so ridiculous how arrogant some people in Congress can be. And, you know, Joaquin Castro, who the Castro twins, man, like, you know, I've kind of had conversations with Joaquin a couple times, and he's good people, and I don't agree with him all the time, but I do appreciate having guys like that there, and having guys like or people like Delia Ramirez from Chicago in Congress, and you know, people who aren't afraid to like get in Kristi Noem's face or
Mhm.
whoever's face and call them out for their business, whether they're Republican or Democrat. If there's a conflict of interest, I want to see my lawmakers do what they do, you know. And unfortunately, none of my lawmakers are like that. I got Ted Cruz and, you know, Wesley Hunt. So
So do you know about the Summit of the Americas, or do you have any thoughts on it if you do? Like I think it's kind of maybe not quite as promising as it once was.
no, you know, the Summit of the Americas, I believe that's coming up soon, isn't it?
Yeah,
I know that
well,
they had one.
my dad was actually a diplomat, and
Oh yeah.
he was responsible for coordinating the first two, like not
Oh, nice.
like just in terms of the um not in terms of the actual content, but the
Like logistics.
the logistics. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So the Summit of the Americas is a tricky one because, you know, recently the Organization of the American States, OAS, didn't include Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba in their latest meeting, which led to Mexico, Brazil, and a few other countries boycotting the thing.
And the Summit of the Americas, just so we let everybody know, it started under Clinton, and it was it's an ongoing plan to help South American countries develop and maintain democracies.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, there's a lot of economic agreements, climate change type stuff, you know, basically like not necessarily treaties, but, you know, support systems for each other. So, you know, trade deals, things like that. I think like the last time when it was in LA, they didn't want to allow Cuba and stuff like that either. AMLO was president of Mexico at the time. You know, he didn't go. He sent a diplomat instead. And that's essentially what happens. Like when Mexico boycotted the last meeting of the Organization of the American States, they sent, you know, somebody from their government, but it wasn't going to be Claudia Sheinbaum. It wasn't going to be who they want to be there. Several countries in Latin America did that. Every time they exclude any of the countries in Latin America because of their chosen government or whatever, a lot of other Latin American leaders balk at that. You know, most Latin American leaders are of the same mind as I am. Like, you know, if they want to govern this way, let them govern this way. We should help support the people, you know, things like that. You know, the organization or the Summit of the Americas is it's kind of a tricky deal. It's become a little politicized, I think. But you know, it's going to really a lot of it depends on who the United States sends too.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
So
I
my
think
dad was saying like the first two under Clinton, like it's the genesis was it was really trying to like have the US pull out of South American politics, basically. Like and just
right.
like get like just this is just a way to you can set up your own governments without us meddling. But then he was retiring right about the time that Bush won, and Bush had sent down orders that they were going to revamp it and everything. And so I think it basically changes with every president what the priorities are. It's just basically changed what its original concept was.
Yeah, it does. It does. And you know, Blinken's team, the State Department, for that last one wasn't very well received by a lot of people. And I think a lot of it had to do with some of our other foreign policy. It certainly had to do with excluding Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. You know, and they were kind of hard nosed about it, you know, in a Marco Rubio sense. You know, Blinken's team was really not much different than Rubio's team is now. Maybe they were a little politer But I keep thinking of Sam Husseini, who was dragged out of that presser at the State Department, you know. And I tend to think that when it comes to dealing with the press and foreign affairs, particularly, the Biden administration wasn't much better than Trump is right now. Aside from the Trump taking aid away from countries, that's a pretty big, horrifying deal.
Mm-hmm.
Especially food aid, medical aid, things like that. I think that's a pretty horrifying deal. But a lot of our government operates on these standing orders, right? Like the Monroe Doctrine. That passes on from president to president. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are the keepers of that doctrine. When it comes to foreign policy with Israel, Joint Chiefs are keepers of that doctrine too. Russia being our enemy, same thing. And that's one of the reasons why it transcends presidents. It's because you got groups like Joint Chiefs that maintain these systems as far as foreign policy goes. Domestic policy is a whole different animal when it comes to like our healthcare, and all these things. But yeah, I think a lot of it is like that. And I think once it became the organization or the Summit of the Americas became so politicized under Bush, particularly after 9/11, and he made everything a national security issue, including immigration. They kind of ratcheted down on a lot in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And it took Mexico, for example, because they're our closest neighbor, some time to recover from that. But I think under AMLO and Scheinbaum, they've seen a lot of progress economically, and trying to help the poor and uplift the poor as much as possible, because that's one of their keys to fighting these cartels, right? Is make life more appealing, as far as make being a contributing member of society more appealing than going to work for a cartel.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying? Because most people that go get into gangs and start working with cartels and get into shit like the Aryan Brotherhood, they come from poverty. They're looking for some sort of sense of community. They're looking to make a living. It's not necessarily easy, but maybe it feels easy at the time.
It's like the whole push versus pull thing. Like,
right.
Instead of like focusing on trying to make coming here less appealing than staying there, make staying there more appealing than coming here. Like,
right.
If you give people reasons to want to stay there, they'd prefer to do that. Like if they can just have a job and support their family, then they would much rather stay where they're from than come over here.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, one of the things that really irked me about Harris, when she was vice president, was, she made it a point to say she was going to try to tackle the underlying causes of immigration, right? Irregular migration is what they called it at the time. And she goes to Latin America and does a speech and essentially says, don't come, don't come. And I'm like, bro, that's not how you get to the root causes of this problem. The root cause are sanctions, right? Like sanctions lead to more migration. Sanctions and war lead to more mass migration events than anything else. And again, like,
and more climate change.
Right. And it's like, again, if you want to stop Venezuelans from coming, lift the sanctions and let Venezuelans live a decent life, you know, and eventually with the right amount of support and, if they want to overthrow a government, it becomes easier when they're not starving, you know what I mean? When they have access to things. So, yeah, I think a lot of people overlook what the root causes really are. They're not, sometimes they are economic, but they're usually, if it's an economic reason that somebody leaves a country, it's probably because we did something to their economy.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to overlook that stuff when, like you said,
the idea of sanctions is not something you hear discussed in the media, but it seems like you're saying that's like the number one factor that we need to look at.
There's been, I've read a couple of studies recently in the last year or two that, they put together a lot of data, and it's hard to dispute that, particularly when it comes to Latin America, that sanctions are the leading cause of mass migration throughout the continent. And, it doesn't mean they're all migrating here, but shifting from one country to another. Anytime you have millions of people doing that at a time, you have to really look at what's going on. And it becomes harder to blame just one guy. You can't just blame Nicolas Maduro or Fidel Castro, who's been dead for God knows how long. And you can't just blame one guy. There's a lot of systemic issues involved, and they come from both sides. I'm certainly not going to absolve Maduro of anything or the Venezuelan government of anything. But yeah, I mean, I can definitely call out our contribution to the madness, and I think more of us should, because we're one of the biggest reasons why we had such a mass migration issue, under Trump's first term and under Biden's term, is because of our foreign policy.
Yeah.
So we don't address those things. It's just like the drug thing and the coping mechanism. If you don't address the poverty and stuff, you don't really get to the root causes of the problem. You're never going to solve it.
Yeah. And I think we're not looking to solve problems anymore. We're just looking to justify positions.
Yeah.
So it's like, we're trying to justify bombing cartel boats with, oh, well, they're, a threat or whatever. And instead of like saying, let's solve the drug problem,
Mm-hmm.
and like maybe that's not even the best example, because the drug boats is more to justify other things. But we need to, if we want to solve the drug problem, what would you do? If you want to solve the problem in Venezuela, what would you do, instead of retroactively trying to tweak things where you're just making adjustments on policy, and down the road you get this Frankenstein monster of stupidity.
I mean, that's kind of what happens, right? Like, that's kind of where we are now, with where like the situation in Venezuela, we're just kind of exacerbating the problem. We're making it worse, and it's leading to more people leaving, and we're just in this vicious cycle.
And I don't even think a lot of Americans know what the problem is in Venezuela.
Right. And
other than Donald Trump says they're talking about fentanyl in Venezuela as though fentanyl has anything at all to do with Venezuela.
Yeah, right. That's not where fentanyl comes from. It's mostly through Central America and directly from Asia. A lot of smuggling comes straight from China and stuff right into the West Coast. But yeah, you get into these situations where the United States is so deep in these narratives that they manufactured against countries, that if you back off now, for example, if you lifted all the sanctions on Venezuela tomorrow and Maduro's still in office, you run the risk of a lot of people in this country getting mad at you. You know what I mean? About appeasing a dictator, because you created this narrative of this evil freaking man, like he's Oz or something, hiding behind a curtain. And now, if you try to help the Venezuelan people, like Obama did with trying to normalize relations with Cuba, there was a lot of backlash to that. And it was nonsensical, right? Because he didn't really lift any sanctions. He didn't really change it. Most of the sanctions of Cuba are legislated through Congress. So you'd have to pass a law to get rid of most of the sanctions against Cuba. But normalizing relationships, and there was some power that he had, being able to allow cruise ships into Cuba and things like that,
like Cuban cigars or something, right?
Right, yeah, he had that power, and it helped Cuba a lot. It helped Cuba's private industry, private businesses, which now represent more of Cuba's income than the Cuban government does. There's more income being generated by private businesses than by government jobs. And that's a big turn for Cuba. Their economic reforms are slow, but they're trying to do what China and Vietnam did, and maintaining their communist or socialist government, while also bringing in free market principles, capitalist type ideas, which seemed to work well for Vietnam particularly, and it normalized relations with the United States by allowing U.S. corporations into Vietnam. I think it started with like Coca-Cola and McDonald's decades ago. And I think that's kind of where Cuba's trying to go, but again, you get so deep in these narratives, and they've been going for so long, that if you back off of them now, you run the risk of looking weak. You run the risk of your voting population getting mad at you. In order to back off of Cuba and Venezuela, you're going to have to come clean, right? You're going to have to come clean and be like, look, Maduro's a dick, but we lied about this, and this, right? The Cuban government sucks, but we lied about this, and this, and like wipe the slate clean and start over and address the real issues, not these manufactured things like Cartel of the Suns and Nicolas Maduro is running the Tren de Aragua gang. Like, no, he's not, dude. Like, come on. I mean, if you really had something on him, why are you still inventing stuff?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense, man.
And so like that's really interesting. Like, I have not thought about that, to be honest. But as like, if you could help Cuba by lifting sanctions, why wouldn't you?
Right.
I mean, like, and especially if it's like evolving more towards capitalism. Like, if that's your goal, and that's what they're trying to do, and the only reason they can't do it is because of your sanctions, then why not lift sanctions?
That was Obama's logic.
We don't have a goal-oriented a foreign policy in anything.
Right.
It's like everything is just to try and maximize whatever's best for what we think is best for whatever corporations or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and that was kind of Obama's logic, what you said right there. If you could help the Cuban people, why wouldn't you? And when Obama like normalized relations with them, their economy took off. Cuba's economy took off. And then here comes Trump and undid all that, and then went back to the whole hardline stance because he had the John Boltons in around him and stuff. And they essentially collapsed Cuba's economy just as fast as Obama helped boost it. And Cuba just hasn't been able to recover from that, and then COVID hit, inflation went through the roof, and Cuba has yet to recover from that. Everything that happens in Cuba happens at a very, very slow pace. And that's because they don't have access to funds. They can't borrow money. They can't seek outside investment. Everybody will tell you, oh, Cuba's allowed to trade with whatever country they want to. And technically, yeah, but corporations run the risk of heavy sanctions if they do business with Cuba. So it's not about doing business with countries. It's about corporations. Like, Cuba can't buy anything that has more than like 2%, 3% US parts in it. So their hospitals, like, they can't get medical equipment, can't get medicine, things like that because of stupid little things like this. And it's like, why are you denying them access to like healthcare stuff? Because they want to prove that universal healthcare will fail. And I hate to say, but
in the long run actually be better for the United States. Like, that's
right.
Even for our economy, like if Cuba is stronger and we lift the sanctions and then Cuba is stronger financially, would they be able to import more things? And would they be able to export more things? Would we have more access to Cuban cigars? Which I never smoked cigars or anything, but apparently people that smoke cigars really like Cuban cigars. So like, both for the consumers and for the producers, we could like actually benefit by normalizing relationships with Cuba.
Yeah, farmers.
Why not normalize it? Why have these sanctions that help nobody and hurt everybody just for pure, that's what we've done reasons?
Right. And it also helps provide stability for the region, for the region in general. You're not going to have a bunch of Cubans trying to migrate back and forth or to here, that people will stay home, and give them access to come visit and, enjoy the United States, and then, go back home if they want to. Same with Venezuela. Like, there's so many economic benefits to lifting sanctions and becoming, good partners with these countries, as opposed to just trying to take and force them to do things, our way. And it doesn't make sense. A lot of people try to use Panama, as an example. Look at what we did for Panama. I'm like, dude, we killed 4,000 people to go collect one guy. let's
Yeah.
not dive into that one. Egberto Willies, he's on Substack. He does the Politics Done Right show. He's from Panama. He was there as a kid when the U.S. invaded Panama and 4,000 people were killed. Like, that's not what anybody wants, I assure
And
you.
it's not something that we like. If you ever go through, and like I was looking at war crimes recently and stuff like that, and the U.S. history of war crimes is really, really ugly and really, really
It
messed up.
is. Yeah.
And there was some ugly stuff we did in Panama. You go and you look at what we did in the Philippines,
Mm-hmm.
and like with FDR, or not FDR, with Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh yeah.
Like where we're torturing people, like kind of a pre-waterboarding thing where they like shove a hose down their throat and turn it on until their belly was expanded, and then they'd step on the belly until they either gave information or died. Like just really horrific things that we did to people.
Wow. I mean, yeah. It's just crazy, because now we outsource that stuff to companies like Blackwater and these private military contractors who are just involved in drug smuggling as anybody else. You know what I mean? So like these private military contractors probably move more drugs than cartels do, and it's just ridiculous because, we look away, the United States looks away from it and hires them to go do things. And, it's just nuts. It blows me away how our government is so deeply involved in drug smuggling and things. And I don't know if you've seen or heard of that book, the Fort Hood Cartel. Man, that's a good one. A lot of special forces guys smuggling drugs, man, being involved in cartel behavior, and like guys at Fort Hood were getting executed, special forces guys, and nobody's like, how's this special forces guy got executed in this field? Nobody questions that. Like, come on, guys. Yeah. Like this guy did, special ops stuff, black ops stuff in some foreign country, and now you find him dead in a field next to Fort Hood, and that's not suspicious to you.
You don't know, like, yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird how easily some of these contractors and special forces guys, because they have access to planes and they have more freedom of movement than your typical like infantry type soldier, that it's so easy for them to fall into something like that and get away with it because they're black ops. They're under the radar already. But yeah, that book came out in August, the Fort Hood Cartel. It's a must read, because it does shine a light on just one aspect of how special forces soldiers can often be involved in smuggling operations. And
it's just like they went overseas and they got like, I know in Afghanistan there's a lot of heroin trafficking and
a lot of that, the CIA was involved, the poppy fields, the opium and all that stuff. It's weird because you talk about how like in Vietnam they were smuggling heroin to our soldiers and smuggling heroin to the US, and then you look at Afghanistan and they're growing the poppies over there, and we're there and we're sort of protecting all these poppy fields, and then all of a sudden we have an opioid epidemic, just like when we had a heroin epidemic during Vietnam. And it's like it's hard to say that our opioid epidemic wasn't tied to Afghanistan when you look at the history of the crack epidemic, the Vietnam thing, Iran Contra, all these different aspects.
I thought the opioids were all like synthetic or something. Am I wrong?
Yeah, but I mean, they still have to get the poppies and stuff, right? Don't they still need that for the drug itself?
I thought it was. For some reason, I'm not speaking as somebody that's
right. I
thought that it was synthetic, but
yeah, I'm not a drug manufacturer, so I don't know either.
Never did anything like that. I rolled a couple of joints when I was in,
Right.
you know, and I've
Yeah.
tried some Delta 8s, but that, you know, my experience with the whole THC is about the
The
sum
extent of
total
it.
of my
Yeah,
drug use.
yeah. Like, I used to drink a lot. I don't drink anymore. It's been a long time since I was a drinker. And the same thing, you know, like I think my biggest vice is cigarettes right now, and I'm dying to quit those, but I can't seem to. But I'll get there eventually.
Dude, the quit. I quit.
Yeah.
I quit December 24th, 1996.
Oh wow.
So,
Damn, that's badass.
so yeah, it was my Christmas present to myself. 3 months later, I got lung cancer.
Oh
So
shit.
that was the
Really?
irony of it. Yeah. So yeah, I got one lung now, but
Wow.
still around.
Damn. Yeah, my dad quit when he was like 62. He's 91 now. So
Wow.
he's like, quit if you want to live as long as me. I was like, I don't know if I want to live that long, but
If I started smoking again, I wouldn't have to worry about the smoke, the cigarettes killing me, because my wife would do that.
yeah, right. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding.
So
But yeah, man, we're in a very weird time. You know, both domestically and you know, internationally. And this whole thing with Latin America is just it's kind of weird because like if you read as much Latin American history as I've gone through, you know, I can't help but feel like this must be what it felt like when the Monroe Doctrine was enacted, where we were militarily kind of heavy in Latin America. And then when the Roosevelt corollary, you know, when we were also pretty militarily heavy in Latin America. And like we've never been that way in my lifetime. And then when I
mhm.
see it now, I just look at it, I look at the map, and like everybody has all these infographics about this is the military might the US has in the Caribbean. And I look at it and I'm just like, this must be what it felt like in 1904
Yeah.
or in 1823. You know what I mean? Like this must be what that felt like at that time, where it was just tense. And like I feel like the only way I will finally feel relieved where I could breathe if the Navy just left. If the Navy leaves the Caribbean, I'll be like,
Yeah.
but
I don't
as
know
long
why we need that big ass boat floating around in the military, in the Caribbean. I don't know why we need to be bombing boats. Like, even if you accept, and I don't necessarily accept that, even if you accept that these boats are carrying drugs, there's still
right.
absolutely no legal reason or logistical reason to bomb them. Like, it doesn't make sense.
No.
If you're trying to stop trafficking drugs, and it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make legal sense in any way. Like, as far as I'm concerned, there's 87 counts of murder on this administration.
Oh yeah. No, I agree. I agree. One of the things that irritates me too is like, you know, it's all over cable news where they're like, oh, the double tap, that's a war crime. I'm like,
Yeah,
every one of these has been a war crime. Like, you can't just bomb boats like that and be like, you know, they're like, oh, these guys were known traffickers in the boat. Like, we knew it before we bombed them. Okay, so go interdict the boat. Let's throw
yeah,
them in court. Let's run them through the system. Let's convict them like
yeah.
justice is supposed to be served.
And
We don't get
it's like, from the legal side, like when they have you noticed this when they you should read my latest Substack, by the way, because it's on this very topic that we're talking about. But like, exactly what you were saying, like, my problem with the second strike arguments is that it vindicates the first strikes. and
right.
and whenever they talk about, these have been designated foreign terrorist organizations. Okay, who designated them? Like, they act like that's just something that happened, not that we designated them foreign terrorist organizations, therefore they're foreign terrorist organizations.
Right. Like
It's
based on what?
like because you said so. That's the
Right.
entire legal justification for everything they're doing down there, is that Trump said so. It's okay to
Yeah.
kill people because Trump said so.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's being overlooked too is I reported in February about Pete Hegseth when he was in Stuttgart, Germany. He did a thing with the press corps right as he was walking into AFRICOM in Germany, right?
Mhm.
He's walking into AFRICOM and he's talking to people, to the reporters, and he was essentially saying that he was seeking the power to conduct drone strikes, which is normally something reserved for the president. And you hear on the media and the news, and everybody's like, Hegseth ordered this strike. Hegseth orders this strike. And I'm like, you remember when people were considering that Obama was about to let generals decide to do airstrikes without his approval? People lost their shit.
Yeah.
Trump didn't do it in his first term. Biden didn't do it either for that same reason. But now they just handed that to Hegseth, and nobody's questioning that whatsoever. Here's a guy who was kicked out of the military. He's unqualified otherwise, dictating who should die via a drone
Easily the
strike.
least qualified Secretary of Defense in our
Of
history.
course, yeah, not even close. And like, and nobody's talking about that. And to me, that's a scandal on its own.
Yeah.
And I've asked for confirmation from DOD about this, and they won't say yes or no. They won't deny it, but they won't verify it either. And now I hear on the news, everybody's like, Hegseth ordered the strike. And I don't see the Department of Defense saying, no, he didn't. The president did. I don't see anybody saying, no, the president ordered that strike. So that's essentially confirmation to me.
Well, Trump said he, like, in his social media post, basically said, like, he was reacting to Mark Kelly, saying that, he's telling the military to disobey his orders.
Yeah.
Right. So if they're his orders, then, when Mark Kelly is saying not to obey them, then they're his orders when they obey them, right? Like,
right. And what's interesting to me too is that without them denying outright that Hegseth is not ordering the strikes or ordering the strikes, whichever, Trump has the immunity, but Hegseth doesn't.
Yeah.
And if those are
Trump pardons him when
right. But I guess a pardon, might save his butt here at home. But I mean, I can't remember. There's several aren't there some international bodies?
There are international bodies and
that are investigating. Yeah.
And constitutional immunity and presidential immunity isn't going to protect Trump from those either. I think.
No, I mean, granted,
off to the Hague.
Granted, like I've said this forever, because we don't put presidents in prison in this country. And I said this a long time ago. I said Trump will die before he sees the inside of a prison. Yeah, I mean, yeah, he got arrested. Okay, give him that. There's a mugshot. I was shocked that even happened.
Every time we, like, when, I think we really screwed the pooch when Ford pardoned Nixon.
Yep, I agree.
Then we just made it okay for the president to commit crime.
Because
you started saying, "Oh, well, he's not legally above the law, but we can't prosecute him." I like what they did in Brazil.
Yeah,
what they did in South Korea. Lock his ass up as soon as we can.
This whole idea that we don't want to prosecute this, or not during close to an election, because it could be too politicized. The public will politicize it. You know what? If a crime has been committed, who cares who politicizes it? Convict the guy. I don't care if he's a Republican, a Democrat, or freaking whatever. Just convict him. Like it happened in Brazil, it can happen here. You know what I mean? So it's just nuts to me that we have this logic in this country about prosecuting somebody and worrying about it being politicized. I mean, of course it's going to be politicized.
Especially when the crime itself is a political crime.
Right.
Donald Trump tried to overturn an election. Yeah. That was political. There is no way to do that with, like it is inherently political already.
I was in Brazil and they
say that.
Right. It was in Brazil that way too. And they did it. They convicted him. And then, I'm convinced that according to like the Brazilian authorities, like there was potential U.S. involvement in trying to get Bolsonaro out of Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he was tampering with his ankle monitor and tried to run to the U.S. embassy so he can get out of there. And he got caught. So instead of spending his time on house arrest, he's going to spend his time in prison. I'm like, dude, you had it made sitting at home.
Yeah.
You had it made. Stupid.
So, anyway, we're kind of just over 2 hours here.
Oh, okay.
Do you you've got your Substack? Do you have anything you want to pitch or anything?
No, my Substack, Decolonized Journalism. I published an article today about Trump's little corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Kind of goes through what we went through, talks about the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt corollary, and then Trump's. The hypocrisy of the whole thing. Like, it just, I laughed when I finally saw him release a corollary, and it was 350 words on a freaking website, not a speech to Congress like every other president did. So,
How many of them were written by Stephen Miller?
no, yeah, with considering all the typos that were in it,
Oh,
because I copied and pasted a piece for a quote, and I was like, red lines everywhere. I was like, what the fuck? I was like, here, let me edit that for them real quick because it's terrible.
like, don't you have an editor? Like, you're the president of the United States.
Like, spell check, bro. Like, because that's what went off was spell
Those
check.
little
I'm like,
red
Jesus
squiggly
Christ,
lines
guys.
are there for a reason, you idiot. Anyway,
So yeah, it was.
to know how apostrophes work.
Yeah, it's just funny. But yeah, man, I appreciate you having me on. This was an awesome conversation. We got to 2 hours, gave us some time to go through some things, and
Well,
I appreciate that.
That's my goal here is I actually like to talk to people that know what they're talking about,
Right.
so I can learn things, and my listeners can also learn things. So
that's what it's about.
appreciate you coming on. I think I might continue the thought here. I'm really interested now in what you had to say about sanctions, and so I'm going to probably dive in and into that and do some study. And I think that's an actual great idea. Like, if we want to solve the immigration crisis, maybe the place to start is stop the thing which is causing the immigration crisis. Like,
right, yeah, and it's not like if you have a justifiable reason to put sanctions on Maduro himself, by all means.
Yeah.
But why are you making the people suffer is what I don't understand. You know what I mean? You want to sanction Castro. You want to sanction the Cuban president? Go ahead. Why are you making the people suffer?
Yeah.
Weaken the government, strengthen the people. Maybe you might see the outcome you're looking for.
Yeah. It's such like way too smart for the US government to think about, but
yeah, right. Yeah. There you go.
But I think I'm gonna do some study on that and probably continue this line of thought tomorrow. Really appreciate having you on.
Yeah,
and we'll talk later.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for watching. Hi, Kitty.